Okay. Today's daf. Welcome back after our Tisha B'Av break. What? Oh, don't worry. Today's daf is Samach Daled, a new parak, 9th parak, and we actually move from a discussion of the scope of the neder, what certain words mean, what the scope of time is, and so on. This isn't working, don't worry. Right now, to the question of hataras nedarim, which is, it's interesting the way the Mishnayot sometimes move back and forth between those two themes, right? So we had a little hataras nedarim before. We had a category of 4 nedarim, which are nidrei ta'ut essentially, right? Remember the category of the 4 nedarim when it wasn't your intention and you didn't really mean it, and so on, which serves as the conceptual basis for hatarat nedarim. So now we once again revisit the issue of hatarat nedarim. So let's take a look. Already a question? Let's read the Mishnah first. What? Yes?
Did you have anything to say in terms of it being unusual that there's a Mishnah and no Gemara at all?
No, I mean, you mean what we did yesterday? Well, was on the day, we did 2 days ago, which was yesterday's daf. Well, no, because it's, to some degree that's a printer's decision, because he could have put the whole thing as a Mishnah and had the little piece of Gemara on the first part of the Mishnah. Sometimes the Gemara doesn't comment on the entire, on major sections of a Mishnah. So it is strange from the sort of printer's, the publisher's decision, to put it here without a Gemara following it. But you could imagine that it could have put the whole Mishnah, and then the little Gemara that went on the first part of the Mishnah. But yeah, because we do expect the Gemara to follow a Mishnah. Okay, let's look now at the beginning of the next parak. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, top Samach Daled. Rabbi Eliezer says, "Potchin la'adam b'chvod aviv v'imo." You open up, for a neder, you open up with the issue of the honor of the mother and the father. What does that mean? It means that you tell somebody, had you known how this vow would have impacted your mother and father, would you have taken the vow? So, b'chachamim mosim, and the rabbis forbid it because they feel that then it'll basically just be a license for everybody to get out of all vows. Now, we'll see more about that in the Gemara. Now, what do you exactly say to the person? So if you look at the Ran says, She'omim lo, you say to him, if you would have known that people will disgrace your mother and father, will say bad things about your mother and father because of you. That people call wicked people the children of righteous people, they still call them wicked the son of wicked, because they reflect on the doings of the child, it reflects on the parents. So people will think poorly of you, and then they'll think poorly and they'll say bad things about your parents. So had you known how your deeds would have led to what people say about your parents, would you have taken the vow? Kluma yita no dare. So that's one thing, that'll lead to people saying bad things about your parents. Another way of saying this is, which seems to me to be just another version of the above, meaning what you do reflects on them. So they'll say, oh yeah, of course this is what you're doing because you must have learned it from your parents. So again, 2 ways of saying that they'll think poorly of your parents. Right. So Rashi says something a little different. Rashi says, She'omer lo, you say to him, Ilo yidudeh she'omim alavicha, oy lo la'av shegadal ben rasha kazeh, she'parutz b'nedarim, she'kein l'shem darkan lindur. So not exactly they'll say bad things about your father that'll reflect poorly on their character or on their child rearing, but that people will sort of say, to your parents, you must feel terrible that you have such a wicked son. Okay, and so who wants people to be saying bad things about you to your parents? So it's not exactly kavod avicha v'imcha, in the same way, but it's like if you would have known how this is going to get back to your parents and it will cause them anguish, to hear about this. Now, of course, it's very interesting because one wonders, how the Nedarim were clearly quite proliferate, and as we read, it occurs all the time. Oh, I'm not going to come to your house for a meal. Oh, well, a neder, all of my things are usher to you unless you come to my house for. It was happening right and left, So it seems that Chazal are also trying. Maybe that's one reason not to be poteach, because it's a little like maybe Chazal's aspirational that people would think this way about people that took vows, and it's not really true. It doesn't really resonate that people really, that this really and genuinely would reflect poorly on the parents. So that might be one reason, actually, although that's not what the Gemara says. The Gemara seems to treat it as if, no, it really will look bad on your parents. But again, one wonders if Chazal are reading the way they would like to see society responding to vows, reading that into how society is actually responding, because it does not seem like as broadly society that people had much of a problem with this. Yes.
So interestingly enough, they're not saying that your parents are actually saying anything about the matter, right? So people are saying to your parents, it's like, you know what I'm saying? They could have said, like, your parents might have really disapproved about this. They're not saying that.
That's a good point too.
So let's say his parents actually like that he made this neder.
Right. Well, it's maybe
he's always had a problem with one.
Yeah.
Thank God.
Well, it's always better in terms of the scope. It's a good point, but but then maybe that's to close off that response. Like, who cares what your actually parents feel? Then it wouldn't be as powerful of a petach. But if it's about how people think about it, then it doesn't matter whether your parents themselves are okay with it. By the way, Tosfos actually says a variation of the Rashi version. Not exactly that they'll say bad things about your parents. More they'll say bad things about you to your parents. Look at Tosfos. He says, people say, have you seen what your son is doing? And they'll be embarrassed as a result. So that works a little bit more with the kavod. But again, not that they'll think poorly about your parents, but it'll get back to your parents and it'll be anguish to them. Okay? And yes.
What's the context of Potzim La'adam? This is at the moment when the guy's about to make the
No. He made a neder, he comes to the base, and we're trying to find a way to get out of it. So we're trying to find a way to say to him, like, the classic way a neder works, right, is through a petach.
Right.
Had I thought at the time I took the vow about A, B, and C, I never would have taken the vow. So Linzer says you have a standard question you can ask somebody. Had you thought about how this would have led to people saying bad things about your parents, or how it would have gotten back to your parents and it would have embarrassed them, or all these types of things, would you have said, right?
So petach potzim is always a technical term in this.
Yeah, exactly. Dov, you have a question?
To me, it addresses one of always seems to me like the key weakness in this idea of Hataras Nedarim.
Yeah.
When you made a neder, you were probably thinking about how it would affect you. Like to say that, I didn't know how much I would really want to take it back.
Right.
But, that's a little specious.
Because you were thinking about yourself, right.
With all the third party,
right.
It gives a whole different thing. Like, you probably weren't thinking about other people.
Right. That's an excellent point. You're right, because the neder is, there's the neder that involves two people, but still, you're trying to get me to do something and I say something about you, but still that's very much just thinking about the two of us, right? It's very self-centered in that way. That's an excellent point, and this is actually broadening it. So we have to figure out why the Chachamim say you don't do that. Okay, we'll see in the Gemara. I'm Rabbi Tzadok, and Rabbi Tzadok already gives an indication why the Chachamim would reject this approach. If you're already prepared to talk about the impact on the parents, or talk about the honor to God. Remember, we sort of are taking this general approach that it's considered to be, not good to take vows. The Gemara before had very harsh terms, right? Anybody who takes vow is roy to be like pierced with a sword. So the Gemara said that you're not potech and petach that way, because that just scares everybody into saying, oh yeah, if I realized that, I never would have taken it, and then you don't get an honest response. But even if you're not that harsh, you can still be potech b'chvod hamakom. Now, what's the chvod hamakom? Is it this idea that we've said that, kol hanoder ki'ilu banabama, that it's basically not a good thing? Or is there something else about that's going on? If you take a look at the Ran, he quotes a b'chvod hamakom. He says, Dahamina b'sifrei, the line starts to word shehu, it's about 10 lines down in the narrow lines, shu kenoder b'melech atzmo, klum hayita noder, that somehow there's an interesting sifrei that distinguishes between noder b'chaye hamelech as opposed to noder b'melech atzmo, and somehow brings God into the world of vows. Now, it's not exactly clear what that's getting at, especially because at most, right, God is very front and center by a shvuah, right? A shvuah is with Shem Hashem, and even without Shem Hashem, we assume for something to be a shvuah, you need sort of like a yad to God's name, right? Lo yinakeh Hashem et asher yisad shemo l'shav. You swear in the name of God. A neder neder is about not God directly, it's about the status of an object. Even if you say konam, it's drawing on your power to make something into a korban, to maybe implicitly dedicate something to God, but it's not so much about like somehow God's front and center and God's honor is being violated when I violate a neder. So it is interesting that the Ram brings that idea down, and again, it's not exactly clear what the logic of that, but I wanted to show you it because it seems like a little bit of a crossover between Shavua and Nedarim, to bring it like, to make a neder somehow about God's honor. So it's more simple to just understand that the Chvod HaMakom here is that you're not supposed to make Nedarim, that, if you take a look at Rashi, Rashi says, so it's like you're not supposed to take vows. Okay, and again, sort of reflecting the rabbi's attitude, right? The rabbi's attitude is vows reflect poorly on your parents, vows are an offense to God, right? Again, not very much the common perception. Anyway, he says, if you're going to bring in parents, we might as well bring in God. Okay, so bring in God, why not? So then he says, in Cain, ein nedarim. So then there'll be no vows, because that's always true. Anytime somebody takes a vow, if it's considered to be like not religiously appropriate, you're not supposed to take vows, right? So then everybody will always say, oh, I didn't mean it, and everybody will get out of it. Okay, that's part of Rabbi Tzadok. Rabbi Tzadok is like a little reductio ad absurdum, right? If you're going to bring in parents, you might as well bring in God. If you bring in God, then there will never be a neder. So of course you cannot do this. Now the question is, well, why not? Maybe it's true. Maybe if somebody had stopped to think about it, they wouldn't have done it, and maybe there will be a general petach. So what would be so bad? Okay, so we will take a look at it. What?
Everybody has parents.
Everybody has parents. Well, that's his point. Okay, so what's so bad? If we don't like vows and we want to try to sort of stop people from doing it so much, and it genuinely is true that if people had thought it through, they wouldn't have done it. So then, why not be potach with parents? Why not be potach with God? Okay, and the Gemara is basically going to say about this, because then you're not going to get an honest response. Meaning, you could have two answers. You could say, that's true, actually, that would work. But then, if we give a petach that works for everybody at all times, right, so then it has the opposite effect. Meaning, on the one hand, it means that people get out of their vows and we have fewer vows in the world, and that's maybe a good thing. On the other hand, it makes people treat vows very trivially. Yeah, big deal. I'll just say I wasn't thinking about God, wasn't thinking about my parents, right? It's too easy. So there's more like a public policy reason why we don't want to give this petach, right? We want to, in a way, make it easy enough to get out of vows because we don't like all those vows around, and we want to encourage people to get out of them and undo them and so on. And on the other hand, we don't want to so trivialize it that it actually means that people take vows left and right because they just feel it's so easy to get out of and it doesn't mean anything. So there could be like that public policy reason. The Gemara is going to say a reason that sounds a little bit more like, because then you're not going to get an honest answer. You're going to scare people. If you say to somebody, do you know how much your parents would be embarrassed if they found out about this? You know how this much active, like an act of rishus to God, so who's going to want to say, yes, even though I knew that I would have taken my vow, right? So it's just too, you're raising the stakes too high, and people are going to say they wouldn't have done it, and you're not going to get an honest answer. So that's what the Gemara is going to focus on.
You
Yes.
read Rabbi Tzadok as an explication of the Chachamim?
Yes, as a type of a showing why they're right because it's a reductio ad absurdum, Okay, so now the Gemara says, Umodim chachamim l'Rebbe Eliezer v'davar shebeino levein aviv imo. Supposing l'bechvod aviv imo. If it would have impacted the parents, like it was a vow not to get benefit from the parents, or not to give benefit to the parents, then clearly you could bring in the parents, right? And did you really think through how this would impact your relationship with your parents? Okay, and then you can obviously bring it in. The Odam Rebbe Eliezer. So that was one thing that you always open up with the parents. Then Rabbi Eliezer says, Potchin benolad. Now this is even a bigger chiddush. You can open up with something that is newly born. You could say something that the person had no right to expect at the time of the vow, and then it occurred after the vow. You could have said to him, had you realized that this would have occurred, I'm saying, neder that I'll never get any benefit, everything that Michael has is usher to me. And then tomorrow Michael wins the Mega Millions. Okay, well, had I realized that, I never would have taken that vow, right? That's nolad. Because if the logic of a petach is, we're going to say that you weren't thinking it through, and if we really got deep down to what you would have wanted, to what you really would have been thinking had you thought it all through, then you wouldn't have taken it, and therefore it was a toad, it was an error, because you were just you weren't really totally sort of processing all of the issues. So in this case, if we go back to how I felt yesterday, I never would have imagined he would have won the Mega Millions, right? So yes, even if I thought through all of the issues, I would have taken the vow because there was no reason for me to have imagined that would have happened in the future. So that's the problem with Nolad. And nevertheless, Rabbi Eliezer says it doesn't matter. We're still willing to say, had you realized that this would have happened in the future, would you have done it? And if you say no, that's a way to get you out of it. What? There you go. You had the Ferrari, you wouldn't give me all picked out. Exactly. Okay, but the Chachamim Osrim, and the Chachamim say it's forbidden. Now, this is different, right? Because the first thing might be more of a policy issue, whereas this might be that it doesn't really work. Because who cares had you known something that you couldn't have known at the time? That doesn't make it into a toast, right? So this debate might be more of a principled debate than a policy debate. Ketzad, what would be an example of this? Amar konim shani nehnel ish ploni. A person takes a vow that he won't get any benefit from a certain person. But now it's a sofer, and then the person became the sofer of the ear. Now the sofer doesn't just mean the guy that fixes tefillin and the mezuzahs. It also means the person that writes out the legal documents, and he's the scribe of the city. So everybody needs his services. How can I get a legal document done without going to him? Oh, shayamasiet b'no v'omer, or the guy was now marrying off his son, and now everybody is expected to be invited to the party. Okay, so this is just a one-time thing as opposed to which is ongoing. And had I didn't realize I was ever going to have anything to do with him. I didn't realize he was about to marry off a child and then invite everybody to the party. Omer, and you said, Ilu ayita yodea shunas sofer. Had you realized that he would have become a scribe, Oshaya masiyah beno, or he would marry off his son, the karov, in the near future. Lo ayiti noder. And this guy said, had I known that, not had you, had I known that, I would not have taken a vow. So konim l'bayit zeh shani nichnas, or somebody says, konim, that this house is that I can't go into it. V'nasa beit HaKnesset, and then the house got bought, and it got turned into a shul.
Oh, that might be good, Neder.
Amar, Yilu Ayiti Yodea Shu Nasa Beit HaKnesset, that I know the house would have been turned into a shul, Lo Ayiti Nodea, I would not have taken it out. Rabbi Eliezer Matir Chachamim Osrim. Rabbi Eliezer say that now here the Matir and the Osrim is not just going on Potchin, whether we open for him, what the Beis Din's procedure is. It also seems like whether the vow remains binding. Right, Rabbi Eliezer says oser, meaning the house is still forbidden. It remains binding. I'm sorry. Rabbi Eliezer Matir, he permits it, and presumably it becomes permissible. The Chachamim say it's forbidden. Presumably not just that Beis Din can't do it, but even b'diavad, it's a problem, right? Because this is the issue. The first part seems to be more of a policy thing, and b'diavad, the first thing might work. Whereas this seems more of a principle thing. That's not a legitimate basis for saying that your vow wasn't binding. That was not something you could have anticipated at the time. And at the time you were totally sincere and might have anticipated, all the things that you would have normally expected. And this was something that you could have reasonably expected, so it does not undermine the commitment, the conviction behind the vow and the sincerity of the vow.
So for case in the concept case?
What? In what way?
I'm asking, what's the difference?
Oh, there isn't a difference.
They're all forms of Nolan.
These are all examples.
Yeah, but what comes
But the first one, wait, are you saying that the Beit Knesset case is l'chatchila? Is like you can't use that?
No. Oh, I meant as opposed to when I said the policy, but l'chatchila b'diavad, I was talking about the case about b'chvod aviv imo. Chvod aviv imo seems to be more of a policy issue, whereas this seems to me more of a question of even like b'diavad doesn't work. Is it really a basis for it? Now, by the way, there is a difference between a nolad that you could have expected as opposed to a nolad that you couldn't have expected, right? So, like if you say to somebody, I don't know, they took a certain vow about not doing something, and said, had you thought through that when it would have come the summer and things would have become so hot and whatever it would have been, like I'm not going to go to that merchat, and he says it in the winter, right? Have you thought through that once it becomes the summer and things come so hot and you would need to clean off? Oh no, actually I wasn't thinking about the summer. I was thinking about the winter because we were in the middle of the winter, right? So that's not like that is something in the future, but it's something you could have thought about. Okay, now you could say like the summer always comes, but if there's other things that you could have imagined, right? I don't know, like had you realized that your kid would have gotten into this university, and that's reasonably possible that he would have gotten in, and I should have thought that was reasonably possible at the time I took the vow, which just hadn't happened yet. So things that would have been reasonably possible that you could have expected, right? That is, everybody agrees you can. The question is a nolad that you did not have a good reason to expect might have happened. That's what the debate is about. Yes.
why is this not a difficult reading on your part? What compels you to interpret the words matir va'osrim differently in the Sefer than in the Reisha?
So you're right. I mean, well, I do think it's a little bit different at the Sefer. So it's not about the words in the Mishnah compelling me. It's conceptually that there's a big difference here, right, between the Reisha, which seems to me to be a policy, and also the difference is that in the Sefer, potchin l'adam is talking to the beis din. Right? Are you poteach to the person? That's a question about what should they do, not b'diavad what happens if they did it. By the time you get to the end, it says, he said, ilu hayit yodei ashu nasa sofer. The guy is saying this, and here they're saying, osrim. So it's not the question about poteach, he already actually said it. So you could still say it means osrim to go ahead and matir on the basis of it. It could still be about the basin, I understand. I'm reading more because I just feel that there is this halachic difference, but there's no text in the Mishnah that really compels me. Yes.
He could have given that response he could have given that in response to their question about had you known.
Right.
But and we still have no insight as to what kind of petach the Chachamim will allow.
Well, the classic petach is just, had you thought about things that you could have expected or that you should have been thinking about, right? But they didn't give us concrete examples. But it could. But one example is in the Mishnah, chvod aviv imo, by something that impacts the parents. So if I said, right, konam, I'm not going to, konam that my car is forbidden to me. No. Modim chachamim Rebbe Eliezer b'davar shebeino levein aviv imo, right? Yeah. Something that impacts the parents, chachamim admit. So if you basically say, Kona, my car is forbidden to me because I want to start biking and I want to get into better health, and then you said, had you realized that you would have had to take your parent, your father shopping or to the doctors, oh no, then whatever, right? That would be exempt. So if you wanted to say something, no, okay, yeah.
Okay, so does it make a difference if he would have said, let's say, Kol invite she'eni nene as opposed to nichnas, and then if it becomes Beit Knesset, you can say you can go in anyway because Mrs. Father had only to?
So that might be about what's considered hana'ah, right? That gets to a question before about, do we always mean hana'ah, or do we also mean any type of use, even if it's not hana'ah? Like when konam sukkah shani nichnas, etc. Sometimes we discuss that, right? Sometimes the konam, is it referring to what's technically hana, or is it concerning to all use? The other question is about, use that's not necessarily related to the mitzvah itself. Like if it's fine, using it as a makom tefillah might not be considered a mitzvah, but using it because it's got a roof and it's raining outside, right? So anyway, but that's an important thing to bring about, which is we've been discussing, right? That a neder can subvert doing a mitzvah, like if you say konam sukkah shani yoshev, tefillin, shani lovesh, etc. What about mitzvah flav lehenos nitnu? But that might be because we're not defining it as hana. We're saying what you're answering is the entering in. You're not answering in hana.
Right, no, I think, but let's say you actually said
that. Yeah, so that could be. Yes, that could be. That might. That is correct.
Everyone would agree that you can go into
that could be, yes.
But not necessarily if it's raining, you just like want
right, that's a whole debate about how to understand mitzvah flav lehenos nitnu. Okay, so let's take a look at the Gemara. But it's correct. There's nothing in the Mishnah that makes it prove whether in the first part, whether we're talking about policy or b'diavad or any difference between the first or the second. I'm just reflecting on my own thoughts about this. Let's take a look at the Gemara. Okay, my Nedarim. What does it mean when they say back, oh, well, if we would, if we would allow this, it will never be vows, because we'll always just say, oh, this is bad to God, and then, okay, so big deal, fine, what's the problem? So, Amar Abaye, Inkein Nedarim Nitarim Yaseh. That somehow means that we're not going to be doing it right. In what way are we not going to be doing it right? So here, everybody pretty much says that then people will say, if you bring God into the equation, or parents into the equation, then you're not going to get an honest answer from me. Who's going to really say, yes, I would have done it even had I been thinking about, the fact that it's not religiously ideal, or had even have been thinking about my parents, right? People won't give you that answer. People are going to say, are going to claim they wouldn't have done it because they don't want to be making such a, brazen type of a statement, and will matter the neder even when we shouldn't. So, for example, look at the Ran. He says, 2 lines down the wide lines, even if some guy would have taken the vow regardless of the fact that, and one imagines that this happens, by the way, all the time, right? That guy, that the rabbis are saying it's not a religiously good thing to do, and the people are still taking the vows. So nobody is being nimna because of God's honor. Nevertheless, if he's standing in front of the beis din, and the beis din is saying to him, would you have done this had you realized what a big sin it was? Right? So he's going to say, so, lo ya'is panav b'kach, lifnei chacham, v'yishaker. He would not have such chutzpah to say, yeah, I knew that you guys didn't like me to do it, or people say it's not a good thing, religious thing, and I did it anyway. He won't say that. The Yomer, he'll be shakir, he'll lie. The Yomer, you're there, there. Okay? So bringing parents or bringing God into the equation is going to get you a dishonest answer, and that's why we don't do it. Okay, again, I think it's possible to read the Mishnah like I said, that it's really more of a policy point. If you create a Pesach that everybody can use and everybody can get out of, then it trivializes Nedarim, right? Maybe that doesn't fit with the word Inkein Ein Nedarim, but you could read it. Ein Nedarim are treated seriously. Nedarim are treated like they're not real, that they're not serious. It undermines its seriousness. Anyway, that's not the way the Gemara is reading it. Abai is reading it that the problem with this, according to the Chachamim, or according to is that you won't get an honest answer.
So you differentiate between kavod avivimo versus kavod makom, right?
Well, that could be Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer could agree that you don't open up a kavod avivimo. Could be that he said by kavod avivimo kavod hamakom. At that point I can see because you won't get an honest answer. Okay, but kavod avivimo, I think you will get an honest answer, and I do want to open up with it. The Rava says in kain any top of samsalam bet in kain any darim nishalim l'chacham. Nobody will bother asking a chacham, and this maybe is more closer to what I was saying about the policy point. People will say, "Oh yeah, why bother go to a chacham? I know this game. Oh, have you thought about that God didn't like it? Would you want it to? No, fine, Muslim. Okay. So have you thought about your parents don't like it? It's such a blanket thing that applies to every single neder that people will just say, so I don't need to go to a chacham. I can get myself out of it. And even if it's true that they will be the exact same process with a chacham, you need the procedure in order to matir the neder. Right? The procedure is based on a concept of toast, but it wasn't really a toast. It's really a case that you really wanted what you said, but we're saying, had you been thinking it through, and that's a process of hataras nedarim, which is done through a basin, which is done through a chacham and through a basin. So even if the reason is genuine, if people feel it's just so universal, they'll think they don't even need to go through the procedure, and therefore it'll just completely, everybody will just matir their own neder.
Yes. Allow for that? Last paragraph, the previous one?
About
cases where you don't even have to go to a chacham.
So there are cases when you don't have to go to a chacham when it wasn't in the scope of your vow, like you sort of said, what was the case about? What was the last case about? I'm not going to go into. Unless you give me this thing, you give my son this thing, then then my stuff is usher to you. And said, well, it's like I received it, but that's because the condition is met. Right? The chiddush is that we consider it to be that the condition is met, or we consider it like this wasn't included in the scope. Right? This person is forbidden to me because right. So when it's not in the scope of your vow, or the condition is considered to have been met, or it's a genuine toast. Right, remember going back to the 4 categories of Nedarim, which are real toast from the beginning, like you're just haggling and you didn't really mean it, or you really made a mistake. Those things you don't need a chacham. But when all the conditions are met, it's in the vow, you were sincere and at the time, and now we're retroactively saying we're going to sort of inspect what you said and get to the bottom of it and see that deep down, you really wouldn't have meant it. That's a process of hataras nedarim that requires a basin. So even if the conditions really are met, it doesn't get permitted until there's a basin. So so that's what the Rabbi is saying. Rabbi is saying is, you just have given such a broad license that it's possible to get out of any vow. People will just matir it for themselves and not even bother going to a basin.
We're saying the same thing. Don't you think that both Abai and Rava and the Ran's explanation of Abai, what's at stake here is the integrity of the judicial process and the status of the chachamim?
Right.
Right.
Well, certainly
public policy, but I see it.
That's a way of saying. I hear that. Yeah, that's definitely a way of saying that. Yes.
But just going to something, beforehand we have the whole Rabbi Akiva thing, right? Like the Nasa Sofer thing.
Yeah.
Right? Rabbi Akiva.
Well, that's going to be the question about what are the types of things that you might imagine might have been able to have happened. That's what you mean by exactly. All right. So now the Gemara says like this. Yeah, because this idea that you're not potech b'nolad, there are some cases in the Gemara that seems to be against it, and the Rishonim have to try to fit that into that system. Okay. That no, you could have expected this and so on. Okay, so now the Gemara says like this. Okay, Tanan. So we have this debate of Abai and Rava. Umodim chachamim l'Rabbi Eliezer b'davar shebeino levein aviv. V'imo shepochim lo b'chvod aviv v'imo. So at least the Chachamim concede the case when it's something that really affects the person's relationship with his parents, or the honor of the parents. So according to Abaye, that says the concern is that people will basically lie, and that's why the Chachamim say we don't ask about Kvod V'Vinimo. We can understand this exception. Here, if the person had the chutzpah to basically take a vow that did impact his parents, right? Let's say a more immediate case. I gave an indirect case, like my car is usher and I wasn't thinking about that I need to use it for my parents. But let's say a person said, my property is usher to my parents, or my parents' property is usher to me. So he directly knows that his parents are involved, and he's still willing to go ahead and to take the vow. So in that type of a case where he knowingly takes a vow, even though it impacts his parents, we could expect that we'll get an honest response from him if he shows up in Beis Din. And we said, had you really thought through how it was going to impact your parents, would you have taken the vow? And he'll probably say, yes! He knew that it was going to impact his parents, that he took the vow. So we're not afraid that by raising the parents' issues, we're going to just get a lie. Because this guy was honest enough, brazen and honest enough, to take the vow knowing how it would impact the parents. So it explains why the Chachamim allowed us to raise the parents in this issue. Okay, you could ask how it's going to do any good, because then he'll say, because then it's not going to serve as a Pesach, but maybe there'll be ways it would. Once we start raising the parent issue, then people are going to just figure out that they can think they can matir their own neder, right? So how can we ever raise the parent issue? Chacham, I potchim. Why do you discuss parents? Then people say, last time I was in Beis Din, they asked me about my parents, so, and they'll bring it in themselves. Now, there's an obvious answer. There they asked you about your parents because the neder directly impacted the parents. You're not going to think that you can use that as a blanket way to get out of Nedarim. Right? So the Gemara says, basically what the Gemara says, Amri, you could say, Kiva kol nidre lo sagi lohon delav chacham, hachanami potchim. Since all other Nedarim you need a chacham, and you don't get this, this allowance in terms of, you don't have this feeling that you can always get out of it. There's this blanket het there. Just mention my parents. It's like the magic, get out of jail free card, etc. In all other cases, in this one case, because it directly impacted your parents, there we brought them in. So that's not going to undermine your sense that you have to go to a chacham. This is a singular exception. It's not a blanket get out of jail free card. Okay. So we have this debate of Abaye and Rava. Abaye says that the problem is that you're going to get a dishonest answer, and Rava says what to me seems like just more, I don't know, for whatever reason Rava's approach speaks to me more, which maybe because it's the language of the Mishnah, like, then we'll just always do it. Right? We could always just mention God. We could always just mention everybody. So the fact that you can always universally invoke it undermines the weight and the seriousness of the Nedarim. People will just, trivialize their own Nedarim and feel they can get out of their own Nedarim and won't go through this serious process. Okay, so that's the issue about bringing in the parents.
It's a double negative. La sagi lahon de lav chacham.
Right. Okay. Now we get to the nolad issue. So that was using a universal petach, and now we get to the nolad issue. So my time is Rebbe Lezer. What's the reason of Rebbe Lezer? Because, the logic of the Chachamim makes sense. If it wasn't something you could have reasonably expected at the time, how can you use it to speak to your frame of mind at the time? So the Gemara says, Amar Kra gets it from a verse. This is what God says to Moshe by going back to Mitzrayim. And if you remember, the Gemara says by Vayoel Moshe Lashevet et Ha'ish, right? Vayoel not just means Moshe desired, but from the word of Allah, of an oath, right? Vishpia Kohen et Ha'isha b'shvuat ha'Allah, that Moshe took an oath to Yitro that he would not go back. So how is he going to get out of that oath? So God is being matir the neder, because he's saying, because you only took the oath because there were people there that were after your life. They've now died. So now you can get out of the oath, because had you been thinking about the fact that they would have died, then you would not have taken that oath. Okay, so that's how he got out of it.
Well, that's
yes.
That's like a huge pun on the Satmar Rebbe's treatise.
I was going to say that. It wasn't a pun. That's why he called it that.
I know.
Because his whole Satmar Rebbe's whole treatise against Zionism is about the Gemara about the three Shavuot, and that's the Vayoel Moshe, right? About the oath. Yeah.
But also, pun is a double pun. Vayoel, his name was Yoel title now.
Oh, that right. Right. There you go.
Okay, that's it.
Okay. Ilu Lobata to learn the entire Masechet just for this. Okay.
Right.
Exactly. All right. So now the Gemara says like this. Okay, Vaha Misa Denolahu. Death is something, not expected. Right? Moshe didn't expect him to die so suddenly or whatever. Who knows? Maybe they would outlive him, he would outlive them, whatever. It's not like so it wasn't something that reasonably would have been expected that would have happened. So Mikan Sheposkin Manola. So you see, you can open up with the fact that something that occurred afterwards that wasn't to be able to be expected, and use that as a basis to undo the vow. Rabbanan, and the rabbis would say back, my tamayu, what's their reasoning? What's the reasoning of the rabbis? Kasavri hanumi ma'isi. Who said they died? Rama Reb Yochanan was the pasuk, but who says that's true? Rama Reb Yochanan. Who says that's how you read the pasuk? Oh, come on, that's not how you read the pasuk. That's how you read a pasuk. Okay, Rama Reb Yochanan. That's like the joke. Oh, that's how a Sfardi reads the Rambam. Okay, Rama Reb Yochanan. Didn't Reb Yochanan say? Shimon ben Yochai. Kol makom shenemer nitzim v'nitzavim. When it says that they were standing, or they were fighting or standing, it doesn't Raviyim. So it starts with the fact that Moshe saw Shnei Anashim Ivri Nitzim. Vayomer L'Hashal Lama Tukareacha. Right? Vayomer Misam Chali Sar V'Shovet Aleinu. So Moshe runs away because of these two Hebrews that were Nitzim fighting. And then later it says, after he returns to Mitzrayim and he has problems with Paro, that he's encountered, that they were nitzavim likratam b'teitam eik Paro, right? The people that were standing to meet them and saying, why did you come? You've only caused us problems, etc. So Chazal, so the question is whether it's every time it says nitzavim. Anyway, so Chazal say, it's a similar type of a response, right? Completely sort of challenging Moshe's authority. Here he is coming to do good. Who needs you? And so on. It's a very similar response. They're similar words, nitzim and nitzavim, and we're looking for who's the bad guy. Where's some good bad guys to find? Well, the Tana Naviram by Korach, it says yatsu nitzavim. So let's just say that they're all the same person. Okay, so if they're all the same person, then it's not true. Kimesu kol hanashim mevakinas nafshecha. Of course, the funny thing is, since one of the people that were mevakinas nafshecha, it doesn't have Aviram. I would have thought it was Para. Right? All right. Somehow, though, that's how we're reading it. Okay. So
It doesn't even informed on him.
Informed on, right, or the word got to him, Paro, but ultimately it was Paro who wanted to kill him. So that's also, right, so somehow it's like, well, since the people that are making trouble and then talking to whatever, they're not there, so maybe Paro also would have moved on or something, I don't know. But one would have more imagined that it would have had to have done with the fact that it says that the king of Mitzrayim died, right? That would have probably been a little more pshat. Okay, anyway,
they calm down.
Here is by claiming that the only people interested, or the source of the whole problem, remains Dasan and Aviram, and Dasan and Aviram are still alive, right? And they were the people that were started this. We could say it doesn't literally mean that anybody died. That's not the point. So what does it mean? So that they died, that they became poor, so they lost their influence, and presumably becoming poor is something that happens. People's fortunes change.
It's akin to dying.
It's akin to dying on the one end, and on the other end, it's not a total no-lud, because it's something that you could have expected might have happened, that they might have lost their influence.
No one says that God can make a few exceptions for himself.
Yeah, that's true. I'm going to be Yoshua ben Levi. Kol adam she'en lo banim chashuv k'meis. Anybody who does not have children is like they are dead. Shene'emar havali banim v'im ayin meisa anochi. And if give me sons or children, and if not, I am dead. The Tanya, right? Arba chashuvim k'meis. There are four that are considered like that. Ani u'mitzar v'sumar min she'en lo banim. Somebody who's poor, somebody who's leprous, somebody who has who's blind, and somebody with no children. Ani dechsiv ki mezu kol anashim. All the people died, and they didn't die, as we just said. A little circular, because it never says they became poor, but that's how we're reading it. Mitzorah Ksiv, Al Nati Kameis, better not be like dead. Now that might have to do with the fact that the very physical affliction turns the person white and pale, as if a person had become dead. But of course, what you could also understand is, right, if you're poor, you're like at the margins of society. If you have no influence, nobody, you're not treated with honor or respect, or so on, and if you're mitzvah, you're cast out of society, right? So somebody who's totally cast out of society, there's a type of a communal, of a death that occurs in terms of that. The summa dichsiv b'machshichim hoshivani k'meisei olam. Look at that, very appropriate to just yesterday. God made me dwell in darkness like the dead. So if you're living in darkness, right? It's that's what we sort of see the dead go into the dark underworld, the netherworld, and so on. And also also, especially, in the past, the ability of a blind person to navigate society. Of course, there were other things that the Gemara, it's interesting.
Those seems to have been very much
right. It is interesting if you try to translate this practically. Why is the Gemara identifying Summa more than, let's say, the Cheresh or somebody who can't speak and can't hear, which has obviously halachically is considered even, more unable to interact with larger society, not considered a bardas, bracketing for a moment, obviously, how that status has changed, halachically and so on, and how that was partly a reality about how society treated such people. I'm not sort of, condoning that, but I'm still saying it's interesting that Gemara identifies the blind person as opposed to people with other types of disabilities and so on that might have made it even more challenging for them. Maybe specifically it is the pasuk and it is that sense of being in darkness. And that sense that, death and darkness and so on, are associated. And that clearly could be because of that sense of, continuity. A person, lives on through their children, they pass away from the world, but their children are their continuity. And what's that sense when a person, doesn't have that? I quoted this before, as Woody Allen once said, he says, I don't want to become immortal through my work. I want to become immortal through not dying. Right? So anyway, all right, so that ties up this idea of the four like Aged, and that somehow explains this because we say that Misa is becoming poor is not so much of a nolad as the idea of dying. All right, let's read. What time is it? Oh, look at that. We started later. We're even a little ahead. Let's read a little bit further. Tanya. Maybe we'll even get to the Mishnah. What are we going to do if we're so ahead? Okay. Hamuder hanami chavero. What? Yom Kippur is coming up. Right. Okay. There you go. Hamuder hanami chavero ein matirin lo ela b'fanav. Somebody takes a vow. You know what? Actually, this is like a nice, juicy sugya. I don't want to rush through it. So let's actually, we'll just end here. We won't get ahead, and we'll pick up here tomorrow. Okay.
Rabbi Linzer.